Hello everyone, Tom with Capo Fetish. Today on the channel, we're going to talk about our 10 least favorite Beatles tracks. So, I've been a Beatles hardcore fan my entire life. I've heard the catalog a bazillion times, back to front. We're talking about close to 60 years here now of listening to Beatles albums. But there are about 10 songs that I've never cared for, and these are opinions I formed from a very early age. I'm talking decades ago when I was a child. These 10 songs I never cared for. I always skipped over when I heard the albums. So let's start this off here. I'm going to start. They're not in any kind of ranking order or anything like that. I'm just going to throw them out randomly. So let's start it off here. First track. And by the way, let's make this perfectly clear here. All these songs are really well written. I mean, these are really well written tunes. I mean, most Beatles tracks are amazing. There's barely a bad one in the bunch, but there has to be 10 if you're a fan, at least 10 that you don't really care for, right? So these are well-written tracks. I've just never really cared for these tracks for one reason or another, and I'm going to explain that right now. So here we go. First track is Long and Winding Road off of Let It Be. Whether I hear it in its Spectre production or if I hear it on the naked version, Let It Be, I just never cared for this track. I've always felt that it's really depressing sounding. Of course, all these opinions, by the way, are very subjective. It's just me. So I know a lot of people love this track. It was a #1 hit. It was their last single they released in 1970. Kind of an anticlimactic way to end their career, in my opinion, but I like the flip side better, which was For You Blue, but of course that was never going to be an A-side. But yeah, I've just never, ever liked this track. As a child playing this album here, I always skipped right over it. Like right after One After 909, I always skipped right over it onto For You Blue. But again, never really liked the track. It's a well-written track, but I always found it super depressing, and I'm not a guy that likes depressing, sad songs in general. So that is one, The Long and Winding Road from Let It Be. Another one is the last track on the White Album, and that is Good Night, sung by Ringo, written by John, I believe. And I don't know if you guys have ever heard the acoustic version of Good Night. That's on the Super Deluxe box set that came out in, I believe, 2018. Completely different than this schmaltzy version here that George Martin produced. If they had perhaps ended the album with that real kind of down-home, kind of earthy version, I think it would have ended the album on a way more kind of uplifting vibe, especially coming after the ominous Revolution 9. I mean, it's such a freaky track, And I don't mind Revolution 9 at all, but I've always found Good Night to be almost more freaky than Revolution 9. I think it's those two tracks stuck together that I've never liked, and it's really, I've always felt like it's a very anticlimactic way to end the White Album. Perhaps they could have thrown in Not Guilty by George Harrison. That was an outtake. Or maybe an edited version of what's the new Mary Jane, that Lennon song. That one kind of goes on forever too. But maybe an edited version would have been good instead of Good Night. But anyway, yeah, Good Night, I've always felt very schmaltzy. The singing by Ringo is kind of odd. I just feel the whole vibe of the track has always been really strange to me. It's never really hit me to the core like so many other songs. And yeah, so that is another one. I have never liked the song Good Night. Sometimes when I play side 4, I just stop right after Cry Baby Cry. Sometimes I play Revolution 9 and then take the needle off, but I seldom get through the album and listen to the entire side 4. So Good Night is another one, a least favorite of mine from the Beatles. Another one off Sgt. Pepper, When I'm 64, coming right off the heels, right following an amazing, phenomenal George Harrison song, Within You, Without You. Just one of those just really like landmark Beatles tracks and a landmark Harrison track. Just always sounded really, a lot of people call this granny music, and I have to agree on this particular track, When I'm 64. It just doesn't fit in with the rest of this album, I've always felt. I know a lot of people are really, really hung up on this album, thinking that it's just perfect all the way through. I've never felt that way. In fact, I would put it right in the middle of their discography. It's never been a favorite of mine, this album, though it does have some absolute highlights of their career on here. But I think, Revolver blows this out of the water by a mile as a full statement, as a full album. But it's a fantastic album nevertheless. I love Sgt. Pepper. But Never liked When I'm 64. It's just kind of one of those silly songs I've kind of always passed over when I listen to the album. And that's it. It was included in the Yellow Submarine soundtrack. It's placed well in that film, I believe, but never been a favorite of mine. Not even close. When I'm 64 is another track off Sgt. Pepper. Another one, shouldn't come as any surprise, is Maxwell's Silver Hammer off of Abbey Road. Third track on side one. You got Come Together starting the album off, one of their just iconic first opening tracks of any of their albums, a Lennon tune. Then you've got Something, one of Harrison's just best tracks. And then you got Maxwell Silver Hammer right after it. I mean, it's just, I know a lot of people love this track, but I always felt like of all songs to follow like Something, couldn't they have just edited out Maxwell Silver Hammer and just put Oh Darling right after Something? That would have been a really good segue. Always felt it was just really an odd combination of Come Together, Something, and then Maxwell Silver Hammer. I think it's one of the, I won't say it's a horrible track, but is definitely on my list as one of my least favorite Beatles tracks of all time. I heard they went through hell in the studio trying to get this down. Lennon was even a part of this song. Harrison and Starr were going out of their minds from continuous takes day after day of this track. And really, it's a very marginal song when you put it up against all the amazing Beatles tracks and McCartney tracks. I think it's one of his worst tracks in the Beatles catalog. So Maxwell Silver Hammer is another one. Now this one here, it's going to hurt for some people, but I don't ever need or care to listen to Yesterday again in my life. Yes, the song Yesterday, the first time I ever heard it was a child from this compilation here, Yesterday and Today. What a great compilation. Side one has Drive My Car, I'm Only Sleeping, Nowhere Man, Dr. Robert. They took 3 tracks off of the British version of Revolver, which was a total sin, and took them off the American version, put them on this compilation. I still like the compilation though, it's fantastic, but when I was a child listening to this album and Yesterday would come on, I would just feel sad. I would feel a sad feeling. Another just kind of depressing Paul McCartney song. I know it's been covered by 10,000 plus artists. I don't really care. I've just never cared for Yesterday. It's a well-written song, but again, I don't really care for sad, depressing songs. And I'm always blown away at how popular this track is out of all the Beatles tracks. So again, Yesterday is one of my least favorite Beatles tracks. This was off of the UK version of Help, side 2, and the first time I ever heard it was on Yesterday and Today, the US compilation. Next one is What Goes On off of the UK Rubber Soul, which was also featured on the Yesterday and Today compilation. And I think that this album is absolute perfection, except for that track. I think this is the low point of Rubber Soul, the UK version. It was taken off the US version. I've Just Seen a Face and It's Only Love were included on the American version, and I like that version of Rubber Soul better. It's probably one of the most perfect sequenced albums of all time, even though those 2 songs were on the UK Help. For some reason, they just really fit on the UK Rubber Soul, I've Just Seen a Face and It's Only Love. But What Goes On just stands out like a sore thumb on this UK version, especially coming after just a perfect side 1. I think it's just a really marginal Beatles track with Ringo on vocals. It's not a horrible track, but it's surely not a great track, and it's definitely one of my least favorite tracks of all time by the Beatles. What Goes On. Another one off With the Beatles. I really love this album. It doesn't get a lot of love when you look at Beatles, best of Beatles lists and, Beatles discographies and ranking, etc. But I've never really liked Hold Me Tight. It's one of my least favorite early Beatles tracks, and I love the early Beatles. I love everything off Please Please Me. Of course, Hard Day's Night is one of their just stellar early albums. But I think it's probably the low point here on With the Beatles. I even like some of the covers better, like Till There Was You. And, of course, Money kicks ass. But, yeah, it's just not a really well-written song. I think they even considered it one of their weaker tracks in the early period. Hold Me Tight. There's that midsection, which is not a real great section of the song. It just seems like it was kind of thrown together in there. But, again, another least favorite track of mine by the Beatles. Hold Me Tight from With the Beatles. Going back to the White Album, another track off side 4, probably my least favorite side of any Beatles album, but one of my favorite Beatles albums of all time, a top 3, is the song Honey Pie. Never really cared for that track. Again, you could call it one of Paul's kind of granny tunes, perhaps, but I've just never cared for it. And it's just another kind of low point on side 4, along with Good Night for me, and Honey Pie, and Revolution 9. It's just one of the oddest Beatles sides of all time, I think. Side 4, the White Album. My favorite track on side 4 is probably Cry Baby Cry. But yeah, Honey Don't, no, not Honey Don't. Honey Pie is one of my least favorites. I like Wild Honey Pie. I know it's just a little snippet and kind of a silly thing, but I like that better than Honey Pie. Another one off of Sgt. Pepper. A while back, I made my own compilation of Sgt. Pepper, my own mix. And I took She's Leaving Home off it. I always found that very almost melodramatic and over melancholy. And just since I was a child, I never liked She's Leaving Home. Really well written, some great string arrangements, but never really hit me in any kind of way. A while back, I placed It's Only a Northern Song in place of She's Leaving Home on side 1, and then off side 2, I took off When I'm 64, and I put Strawberry Fields and Penny Lane in the mix. So it's like a perfect 14-song list of Sgt. Pepper. It's just perfect. If you take She's Leaving Home off there, put Only a Northern Song in its place, get rid of When I'm 64, and put Strawberry Fields and Penny Lane in there. This album is an absolute, in that particular order, in that kind of segue, it's perfect. So She's Leaving Home, another least favorite. And then for me, the most overrated, overplayed, over-discussed Beatle track of all time for me is Hey Jude. Even when I was young, I was never really a fan of Hey Jude. I know people think this is one of their greatest tracks. It's probably their most played track on every type of radio station, satellite radio, regular radio of all time. It's played nonstop. Is it because it's 7 minutes long? Is it kind of like, does it have that kind of stigma like Freebird or Stairway to Heaven or Layla? Is it that kind of thing where it's just a long track and people love it for that reason? I don't know. But I've never really cared for Hey Jude like so many other people do. And for me, it's one of my least favorite Beatles tracks. And there you go. Those are my 10 favorite least Beatles tracks. Let me know what yours are in the comments section. Thanks for watching. Take care, everybody. Bye-bye.